Iran is simultaneously one of the most powerful and vulnerable economies in the world. It has immense and often unwelcome influence over its region, the largest energy reserves of any country on the planet, and a massive population that is remarkably well educated. On top of that, its position in the world could arguably not be more ideal. It's strategically placed with a large coastline along some of the busiest trade routes on the planet, and it's almost exactly at the centre point of the global population, making potential business with both established centres in Europe and rapidly developing markets in Asia a golden opportunity. This isn't a theoretical possibility either. Directly across the Persian Gulf, its neighbours, Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, Oman, and even Saudi Arabia, are all enjoying the spoils of their fabulous oil wealth. And yes, they clearly have problems of their own, but with an average GDP per capita 10 times higher than Iran's, they at least have the wealth to pretend those problems don't exist. So yeah, the problem is that despite all of these advantages, Iran is also one of the most vulnerable countries in the world. Its economy is based heavily on oil and gas exports, which is bad for any country at the best of times because it creates dependency on a single volatile industry that is extremely easy to exploit. But of course, for Iran, it's even worse because it's hard for them to even sell the oil that they do have. Iran's economy has almost become defined by the sanctions that it's lived under for the past 45 years. Trading directly with the country outside of very narrow exceptions is enough to get individuals, companies, and even entire national economies blacklisted from global trade and finance. This endless tension, of course, came to a head a few weeks ago when the US conducted strikes on the nation's believed nuclear facilities, something that was a not-so-subtle escalation from its conflict with Israel, the de facto rival regional power. Now, this video is not about those strikes or speculation on what they may mean for the future. Nobody can predict it. In fact, this video was actually in production well before the US Air Force dug some holes in a mountainside somewhere. Realistically, these were just the latest events in a long history of adversary with the USA, which, for better or worse, still largely calls the shots when it comes to who gets to play in the global economy. So, with that, it's easy to conclude that Iran never really had a chance. However, it's made plenty of its own mistakes as well, which has put it into an extremely difficult position. It can't improve its economy without radically rethinking the way it operates, and its leaders can't change the way that it operates without potentially losing their failing grip on power. This is a real shame because the country has immense potential to not only massively improve the lives of its citizens, but also the rest of the world through energy, trade, and regional stability in one of the most important crossroads on the planet. So, what is Iran's economic dilemma? Is there a reasonable path to reintegration in the global economy? And finally, beyond the headline-grabbing global issues, what are the challenges the domestic economy in Iran is facing? Running Economics Explained means working with editors, researchers, and collaborators all over the world, and sometimes that means needing access to powerful machines without actually being in the same room. That's where AnyDesk comes in. It gives you super fast responsive access to your computer from anywhere, and it really does feel like you're right there in front of it. Perfect for editing, troubleshooting, or just moving large files between systems. And unlike most tools, file transfers don't go through the cloud, they're direct and secure, which is a huge plus for working with media or sensitive data. You also get real-time audio pass-through, which is surprisingly helpful if you're scrubbing through edits or reviewing clips remotely. Plus, it's available on basically everything, Windows, macOS, Linux, even a Raspberry Pi, and it works reliably even on slower connections. It's free for personal use, and there are scalable plans if you're working with a team like we are. If you ever need access to your work setup while you're on the go, give AnyDesk a try. You'll find the link in the description below. So, when it comes to Iran, it's important to first address the liquefied dinosaurs in the room. Iran is arguably the most energy-abundant country on the planet. It has the third largest oil reserves behind Venezuela and Saudi Arabia, and the second largest natural gas reserves behind only Russia. Combined, this means it has almost endless fossil fuels, which are not only plentiful, but are very easy to extract compared to facilities in the North Sea, shale extraction, or Arctic fields. Together with the fact that Iran is in such an ideal location to either pipe energy straight into China or ship it through some of the most active routes in the world, this should be an easy way to effectively guarantee some level of economic prosperity. Yes, of course, there are major economic problems that come from an overdependence on oil exports, or any singular export for that matter. But Iran has so much of the stuff that it can effectively just brute force a pretty high level of output and worry about how to distribute it later. The best way to do this would be to use those revenues as seed capital to try and develop alternative domestic industries, similar to what their neighbours on the other side of the Persian Gulf are doing to various levels of success. If that's too difficult, there is always the option of just investing the money in global markets and establishing a welfare system for people to enjoy a certain quality of life, regardless of what ends up happening with their energy reserves. But that hasn't happened. The country may have the greatest energy potentials on the planet, but as any disappointed parent will say, potentials aren't always lived up to. Putting aside the export challenges for a second, Iran has had a major problem just providing energy to itself. The country has almost limitless natural gas on tap and enough power plants to turn this into electricity, and yet it's been dealing with prolonged blackouts because its infrastructure is aging and is largely mishandled. Now, partially this can be explained away by the fact that it's difficult for Iran to get modern electrical equipment due to how heavily they are sanctioned. Iran is a large country that gets extremely hot in summer and extremely cold in the winter, so there is a huge demand for energy just for domestic climate control. All of that transmission requires a lot of infrastructure that the country does not have the capacity to build itself, and since Western companies are forbidden from trading directly with Iran, they can't get it from the typical suppliers either. Now, to be completely fair, that's actually not a situation unique to just Iran at the moment. A report from an organisation with a name that feels slightly targeted has shown that vital grid components are in short supply everywhere. The world is in the process of converting grids to accommodate renewable energies, which are now cheaper but more sporadic. On the flip side, grids have also had new loads added to them from data centres, cryptocurrency mining, and now of course AI. The point is, the companies that make this infrastructure can't keep up with new demand, so there is very little incentive to even indirectly supply a sanctioned country like Iran when they can sell their products at a significant markup to customers who aren't going to get them into trouble. Now on top of this, it's not like Iran has tried too hard to fix this either. Realistically, they could probably work with China, who is now by far their largest trading partner, to exchange their cheap fossil fuels for some of these tools. China's corporations still officially have to abide by sanctions if they want to do business with the West, but they have become very good at covering their tracks just enough that nobody really questions it. We will actually get to that whole system soon. The problem is that Iran doesn't necessarily want its abundant energy to become more accessible. One of the most direct ways that Iran uses its oil wealth to support its people is by directly subsidising oil and energy. This has led to a situation where energy to consumers is extremely cheap, even when accounting for the low incomes in the country. But when something is almost free, people don't value it as much, which means there has historically been few incentives to make energy usage more efficient. One of the biggest cottage industries to develop in Iran has been the previously mentioned cryptocurrency mining. Unofficial operators can use the country's highly subsidised energy to generate an asset that is useful for getting around the nation's sanctions. Officially, the government condemns this and points to it as the reason why people are experiencing blackouts, rather than other issues like general corruption and incompetence in managing the infrastructure that does exist. Usually, the relationship between economic output and energy usage is almost perfectly correlated. Wealthier economies both use more energy to fuel the industries which helps them get rich in the first place, and once they are rich, energy is used to provide transportation, climate control, and high-end products. The correlation is almost striking, but even within this data, there are of course outliers. Countries up here use a lot of energy for not a lot of economic output, and down here generate a lot of output without using that much energy. Iran uses more energy per capita than Denmark, but yet produces about a fifth of the output, even after accounting for purchasing power. It should also be noted that this graph adjusts for purchasing power with an arguably very generous estimate of Iran's true cost of living, thanks to their broken currency, and we'll also be getting to that. Put more simply, Iran is one of the least energy efficient economies on the planet. What this means is that Iran has a lot of energy that it can't really sell that easily, and it can't even use that effectively. Now of course, this goes beyond purely economics, but the whole energy schmozzle also understandably raises some eyebrows over their supposed intentions to develop nuclear energy as a means of energy production. Realistically, they have all of the energy that they would ever need. Their problem is utilising it. Now, even though chronic energy crises in the single most energy abundant country on Earth is clearly very embarrassing, it's not the heart of the problem, more just a very obvious symptom. Making improvements to grid infrastructure would be possible, but since energy is so heavily subsidised anyway, there isn't a huge incentive to work around sanctions to make it even easier to get at. The same is true for things like oil refining. In the past, the country actually imported a lot of petroleum because it couldn't refine enough of the stuff itself. But when sanctions were heightened around 2010, it moved to develop its own refining capacity so that it could actually use its own reserves to power its own economy. Now, these refineries were not great. Partially this was because getting the modern tools and components that goes into making these facilities was very difficult, and partially because of grift and graft that has become so endemic to the nation's organisations. They did produce gasoline though, enough to maintain the heavily subsidised supplies to their own people, and actually start exporting to neighbouring states that Iran is friendly with. The problem was the gasoline coming out of these crude refineries was so bad that it was destroying car engines and causing major air quality problems around big cities. It was cheap though. As something of a Faustian bargain with its people, Iran has always tried to provide gasoline at a rate of 30,000 rials per litre, and in the past it even offered up to 150 litres per vehicle per month at half that price. Now on paper, that works out to be roughly 70 US cents per litre or $2.65 per gallon, and half of that for the first 150 litres, which is clearly a damn good deal. I'd make that deal. But it's not the whole story. That number is based on the official exchange rate, which is in turn based on not a whole lot. Thanks to sanctions, not much official private trade is done, and inflation in Iran has been extremely high outside of the few things that are subsidised. People are so keen to get their hands on internationally recognised currencies that the actual exchange rate is about 20 times higher than the reported exchange rate. Now what that means is that the true price of gasoline within Iran is more like 5 cents per litre or 17 cents per gallon. This has created a thriving black market where people will smuggle this radically discounted fuel into neighbouring countries and sell it at a 2,000% markup and still work out cheaper for the buyers than the official retailers. Put another way, potentially the most lucrative and effective oil business in the most energy-rich country on earth is the people trucking the stuff over the border in 44-gallon drums. It would almost be comical if it wasn't so sad, because behind all of this is millions of people who could easily be afforded a much better quality of life, but they aren't because the status quo is convenient. Obviously, a pretty common theme throughout Iran's challenges has been sanctions. Reducing those would obviously go a long way to improving the economy, but the problem is, the economy is not a singular entity that gets to make its own decisions. It's the product of a lot of opposing incentives. The US wants to maintain control in the region and is highly opposed to the production of nuclear weapons that may be used against them or their allies. Now, obviously, there's been a long, ongoing debate about the US being a global police force and whether they should have a say over what other countries get to do, but like it or not, for now, they do. Either way, Iran has consistently been one of the most sanctioned countries on the planet. Now, for most countries, that effectively means that they can't do business with Iran either, even if they don't individually want to get involved in the whole situation. Businesses doing business with Iranian organisations can be cut off from operating in the US. They can also be cut off from US banks or insurance agencies, as well as the US-centred SWIFT international transfer system. Naturally, the USA is just a more valuable commercial centre to work with over Iran, but even companies or countries that don't do business with the USA still need to comply because they might want to do business with a business that does do business with the USA. And global know your customer laws means that even several degrees of separation can cause problems. The first group that this is convenient for are the organisations that are happy to circumvent these rules to smuggle Iranian oil out of the country and smuggle other goods back in with a major markup each way. Now, Iran itself is also not without friends. It was one of the founding members of OPEC, an organisation that could push back against US influence in a big way if it really wanted to. Collectively, OPEC controls about 60% of internationally traded oil, which has been great for making sure that oil prices remain favourable, but it also means that it could theoretically say leave Iran alone or else we will turn off the oil, and most countries would have to comply. Now, of course, they haven't done that, because while these countries do all technically cooperate with one another, they only do that to control oil supply, not to achieve other geopolitical goals. Or at least that's the official line. Even if that were the case, a lot of members within OPEC are otherwise just as hostile, if not more hostile towards Iran than the USA is. And finally, the whole OPEC system works by each individual member sacrificing a little bit of their productive potential to keep supply limited. If Iran is not allowed to sell its oil anyway, that just makes the whole thing easier for every other nation, because then they get to sell more than they would have otherwise been able to with another member supplying global oil demand. The status quo is also convenient for countries like China, who are the greatest beneficiaries of cheap black market energy being supplied by Iran. Without those sanctions, they would have to pay the significantly higher market prices for a lot of their energy needs. But on top of all of this, the status quo is convenient for the nation's leadership. Concessions to the West would be seen as weakness from fundamentalist groups within the nation, and concessions to their own people are seen as a slippery slope. Iran's heavily subsidised oil and energy, for example, are clearly not working as intended. They've just been exploited by people arbitraging the unsustainable discounts to make money. However, when they tried to repeal these discounts, the country saw some of its most intense civil unrest since the revolution that overthrew the last regime. Now, we actually already made an entire video a few years ago on why Iran isn't highly motivated to give their people economic freedoms and opportunities. So, as always, we don't want to repeat too much here, but while the status quo might be convenient for all of the parties with power, even if it does come at the expense of the people, it is a status quo that's not going to be sustainable long term. Unemployment is high, inflation is high, brain drain has been a chronic issue for over 50 years, and on top of that, Iran actually has a very rapidly ageing population. Young productive workers are leaving whenever they can, leaving behind older people for the state to support. And despite their strictly enforced cultural values, one thing that hasn't translated to is birth rates. Iran has one of the lowest birth rates of any low-income country in the world, which means all of the problems are only going to get worse as the population gets progressively less productive. Realistically, making structural and lasting improvements would require walking back a lot of the systems that people have come to rely on, which in a country that is already in such a vulnerable position is not something that leadership is going to be willing to do. That leadership, which is largely very old themselves, is also structured in a way that is fundamentally resistant to change. Not just because of their very traditional values, but also because that leadership is a very strange blend of private industry, theocracy, and governance all rolled into one. Now, this is more politics than economics, but we have made an entire video on Iran's political hierarchy over on our second channel, Context Matters, which you should be able to click to on your screen now. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.